There is a short film in the Disney archives that the company has never officially released to the public, and that almost nobody who works at the studio today has seen in its complete form. It was made in 1982 by a young animator who had been working in the studio's animation department for approximately 2 years. The film is 6 minutes long. It is shot in black and white. It is animated in stop motion. It tells the story of a 7-year-old boy named Vincent Malloy, who imagines himself as Vincent Price, who inhabits, in the privacy of his own mind, a world of gothic darkness and Edgar Allan Poe inflected nightmare, while the pastel suburban world outside his window continues its indifferent normality. Vincent Price narrates it in verse. The verse was written by the young animator. The film is called Vincent, and it is, in the judgment of the critics and film scholars who have examined it carefully across the 40+ years since it was completed, a minor masterpiece, a fully realized work of animated filmmaking that demonstrates in 6 minutes a creative intelligence of rare and specific quality. Disney shelved it. They showed it in a limited number of theaters. They submitted it to a small number of film festivals, where it won awards and received the kind of response that genuinely accomplished work receives from people who know what they are looking at. And then they put it in a drawer. The specific decision-making process by which an organization determines that a piece of work is good enough to make and not worth distributing is a process whose logic this documentary is going to examine. Because it is the same logic that 2 years later fired the young animator who made it. And it is the same logic that, in a different form, structured the institutional relationship with his work for the decades that followed. The young animator's name was Timothy Walter Burton. And the story of what Disney did with Vincent in 1982 is the story of what the entertainment industry does with genuine creative strangeness told in miniature, before the scale of what he eventually became made the stakes too large to ignore. This documentary is going to examine why Disney rejected Tim Burton, not in the surface form that the standard biographical account uses. The story of the weird kid from Burbank who didn't fit in at the most famous animation studio in the world and went on to become one of the most commercially successful filmmakers in Hollywood history. The triumph of the outsider narrative that the entertainment press has been telling about him since Batman in 1989. That story is true as far as it goes. It does not go far enough. The full story is about the specific nature of what Disney could not accommodate and why, and about the specific costs and consequences of the accommodation that the industry that eventually embraced him extracted in return for the embrace. It is about the specific relationship between a creative sensibility of genuine singularity and the institutional machinery that the entertainment business builds to process creative sensibility into commercial product. And it is about what that relationship looks like across a career measured in decades, the compromises it produces, the work it enables, and the work it prevents. It is also, at its most personal level, a story about the specific experience of making things in a world that does not have a category for what you are making, and about the specific resilience that surviving that experience requires, and about the specific price that the resilience extracts from the person who survives it. If you're here for the stories that the industry doesn't tell about itself, about what happens to genuine creative vision when it runs into institutional power, subscribe. This channel is built for exactly this kind of examination. And this particular story is one of the most instructive ones the industry has produced. Timothy Walter Burton was born on August 25th, 1958 in Burbank, California. His father, Bill Burton, worked for the Burbank Parks and Recreation Department. His mother, Jean Burton, ran a cat-themed gift shop. They lived in a house in the specific kind of American suburb that post-war prosperity and post-war anxiety had produced in the San Fernando Valley. Identical houses on identical streets, manicured lawns, a social order organized around the performance of normality and the management of anything that didn't fit the performance. It was in the geography of his imagination, the landscape he would spend his entire career examining and subverting. The suburb is everywhere in his work, in Edward Scissorhands, in Beetlejuice, in Batman's Gotham City, as a kind of suburban nightmare scaled to urban dimensions. He didn't go back to it because he was nostalgic. He went back to it because he never fully left. He has described his childhood in Burbank with a consistency across 30 years of interviews that suggests the description is accurate rather than crafted. A childhood of intense interior life and intense exterior isolation. He spent time alone in his room. He drew obsessively, continuously, using the drawing as the mechanism by which the interior life could be made visible in a form that could exist outside of him. He watched horror films and monster movies on television, the late-night programming that broadcast the Universal horror films, and the Hammer horror productions, and the low-budget science fiction of the 1950s to insomniac children in the San Fernando Valley. He absorbed them with the specific appetite of someone who has found in fictional worlds of darkness and strangeness and the thing that doesn't belong, an emotional landscape that corresponds more accurately to the interior experience than the bright, normative world outside the window. The German expressionist cinema of the 1920s and 1930s, the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Nosferatu, The Golem, the films of Fritz Lang, arrived in his developing sensibility alongside the horror television and produced in combination with it the specific aesthetic vocabulary that every serious examination of his work identifies as the dominant influence on his visual language: the distorted architecture, the exaggerated shadow, the exterior environments that reflect and amplify the interior psychological states of the characters who inhabit them, the specific visual grammar of a world in which the outside and the inside are not separate, in which the weather, the buildings, the light, the scale of things all express the emotional reality of the story rather than the documentary reality of the physical world. This was the language that spoke to something deep in his experience. He did not find it in the films being made around him in the American cinema of the late 1960s and early 70s. He found it in films made in Germany 40 years before he was born, in a cultural and historical context entirely different from his own. Disney was the other influence, the earlier one, the one that predated the Expressionists and that coexisted with them in his developing aesthetic sensibility, in a relationship that was never quite comfortable. He has described watching Disney films as a child with genuine love and genuine unease simultaneously. The love that the visual and storytelling accomplishments of the best Disney films generated, the genuine beauty of the animation, the emotional power of certain sequences, the specific quality of the world building that made the Disney animated features feel like complete and habitable, imaginative spaces. And the unease that certain elements of those same films produced in a child whose own sensibility was already organized around things that the Disney aesthetic was organized against. The villains, who were always more visually interesting than the heroes, more dynamic in their design, more psychologically complex in their motivation, more alive on screen in the ways that characters in whom genuine creative energy has been invested are more alive. The darkness in certain sequences that the studio tried to manage and could not fully contain. In Bambi, in Dumbo, in the witch's transformation in Snow White, that the child watching them received with a quality of attention that was different from the attention the rest of the film had generated. He was watching for those moments, the moments when the carefully maintained bright aesthetics cracked and something else came through, something with more shadow and more strangeness than the institutional culture of the studio was trying to produce. Those moments were not what Disney was making. They were what his sensibility was tuned to find. And the specific tension between the Disney of the bright mainstream and the Disney of the cracks, between the institution and the thing in the institution that exceeded the institution's intentions, is a tension that his work has been exploring in various forms and at various scales for his entire career. At 12, he won a contest organized by the city of Burbank for a design for an anti-litter poster. The prize was having his design printed on the city's garbage trucks. It was printed. He has told this story in interviews with a specific quality of humor, the humor of a person who has learned to appreciate the specific irony of a creative sensibility being recognized for something, and that recognition taking the form of garbage trucks. It was his first experience of the specific dynamic that his career would reproduce at much larger scale. The creative work recognized by an institution for reasons that did not fully correspond to what the work was actually doing. The institution saw the poster, he had made something else. He applied to the California Institute of the Arts, CalArts, the school that Walt Disney had founded in 1961, primarily to train the next generation of Disney animators, and that had become, by the late 1970s, the primary pipeline through which new talent entered the studio's animation department. He was accepted. He studied character animation for 3 years. His work was technically accomplished and aesthetically unlike anything else being produced in the program. Darker, more influenced by the expressionist lineage, more interested in characters whose visual design reflected psychological interiority than in the clean, appealing, rounded forms that the Disney animation tradition privileged and the CalArts program was teaching its students to produce. The instructors recognized his talent. The strangeness of what he was producing was less easily categorized. He was hired by Disney in 1979. What happened when that specific sensibility, the one the Burbank bedroom and the late night horror films and the German expressionists had formed, encountered the institutional reality of the world's most powerful animation studio, is the part of this story that the official accounts have never told with the specificity it deserves. Subscribe if you haven't already. What comes next is about what Disney did with a talent it could recognize but could not use. He joined Disney's animation department in 1979 as a junior animator on The Fox and the Hound, the studio's first major animated feature to be produced primarily by the CalArts generation. His contribution to the film was minimal, in the specific sense that junior animators on large productions are always minimal. One voice in a large chorus, assigned to portions of the work that the production's internal hierarchy has determined can be assigned to the least experienced members of the team. What is documented about his experience of working on the film is not the work itself, but his experience of doing it. The specific quality of disconnection that comes from being required to produce work in an aesthetic vocabulary that is not your own, in the service of a story whose emotional and visual register is not the register your sensibility inhabits. He could animate Disney foxes and Disney hounds. He had the technical skill. What he did not have was the ability to care about the work in the way that the work required at the level of genuine engagement. His sensibility was elsewhere. The drawings that accumulated in his sketchbooks during the Fox and the Hound period, the drawings he was making when he was not making Disney foxes, were the drawings that would eventually become Vincent and Frankenweenie and the early concepts for The Nightmare Before Christmas. They were drawings of damaged, strange, wrong-shaped creatures who did not belong to the world they found themselves in. They were drawings of the interior landscape that the Disney aesthetic had no room for, and that he was carrying around inside him, expressing it in the margins of the work he was being paid to do. The studio was aware of the gap, the specific mechanism by which large creative institutions manage employees whose talent they recognize but whose output does not fit the institutional framework is a mechanism of tolerated eccentricity. The employee is kept, and some latitude is given for the eccentricity in the hope that the talent will eventually be usable in the mainstream work. Disney gave them some latitude. The latitude was the space in which Vincent was made. Vincent was produced in 1982 with a small budget that the studio provided on the basis that the project was worth attempting as an experiment in stop-motion animation technique. Stop-motion was a format Disney had not worked with extensively and was considering as a potential addition to its technical capabilities. Burton proposed the project and received the resources. What he made was not an experiment in stop-motion technique in any sense that the studio's framing implied. It was a fully realized artistic statement. 6 minutes of black and white stop motion telling the story of a 7-year-old boy who imagines himself as Vincent Price, who inhabits a world of gothic darkness and Poe-inflected fantasy, while his actual life in a tidy suburban house with a normal family proceeds around him. The visual language was pure German expressionism applied to stop-motion animation. The emotional content was autobiography, not literally, but in the deeper sense that the best self-expressive work is autobiography. The boy who could not reconcile his interior world with the exterior world his parents provided, the boy who found in fiction a landscape more habitable than the one outside the window. Vincent Price, when Burton contacted him about narrating the film, was enthusiastic in a way that the subsequent accounts describe as immediate and genuine. Price had spent his career as the defining face of a specific tradition of horror and gothic filmmaking, the American International Pictures productions, the Roger Corman Poe adaptations, that had been dismissed by mainstream critical culture as genre entertainment, and that he had always understood as something more serious than its dismissal acknowledged. He recognized in Burton's project a sensibility that was in genuine dialogue with the tradition he had worked in, and he narrated the film with a quality of care and commitment that the finished film reflects. He and Burton became friends. Price was in his early 70s, Burton was 23. The friendship across that distance, the old master of the Gothic tradition and the young animator who had absorbed that tradition in a Burbank bedroom, is one of the more affecting details in the biographical record of Burton's early career. Disney's response to the finished film was the specific institutional response to something they could recognize as accomplished and could not figure out how to use. It was screened at a small number of venues. It was submitted to film festivals where it won awards. It received positive responses from critics who saw it. Vincent Price was publicly and enthusiastically appreciative, and Disney decided not to give the film a meaningful distribution. The specific reasoning documented in the accounts available is that the film was too dark and too strange for Disney's audience, that the demographic whose consumption of Disney product the studio's business model was organized around was not the demographic to which a 6-minute gothic stop-motion meditation on a boy who fantasizes about being a horror film icon would appeal. The reasoning was not entirely wrong in the narrow commercial sense. It was completely wrong in every other sense. It was the reasoning of an institution that had evaluated a piece of work against the wrong standard and found it insufficient by that standard, and had not recognized that the standard was the problem. Hansel and Gretel was the next project, a live-action adaptation of the Grimm fairy tale made for Disney's cable channel that he directed using an all-Asian cast and a visual aesthetic drawn from Japanese kabuki theater. It was completed in 1982. It was broadcast once at midnight on Halloween in 1983. It was never broadcast again. He found out it had aired only after the fact. The pattern was becoming visible, work that was made and then managed into near invisibility by an institution that did not know what to do with it. Frankenweenie was the film that ended the relationship. Made in 1984 as a 29-minute live-action short, it is the story of a boy named Victor Frankenstein whose dog Sparky is killed by a car and who uses the principles of electricity borrowed from his science teacher's demonstration of electrical stimulation on a dead frog to bring the dog back to life. The other children in the neighborhood learn of the resurrection and attempt to replicate it with their own pets, with results that escalate in the specific direction that any viewer familiar with the horror tradition understands immediately, and that small children encountering it fresh would find genuinely frightening. The film is funny and moving and visually inventive. It demonstrates with a completeness that the subsequent career confirms that he had arrived by 1984 at a specific creative identity, an aesthetic vocabulary and a set of thematic preoccupations that was not going to change his fundamental character regardless of the institutional context it was working within. Disney fired him. The official reason was that Frankenweenie was too scary for children and inappropriate for the family audience that Disney's films were designed to serve. The assessment was, in the narrow terms of Disney's self-conception, at that particular institutional moment, defensible. Frankenweenie dealt with death and loss and the grief of a child who cannot accept the finality of losing something he loves in ways that were not comfortable and were not resolved with the clean emotional management that family entertainment conventionally provides. It was not, by the aesthetic standards of Disney circa 1984, a Disney film. What the assessment failed to recognize, what Disney's institutional culture had systematically failed to recognize across the years of his employment, was that the tradition it was protecting had its own deep relationship with exactly the themes that Frankenweenie was exploring. Bambi's mother's death, Dumbo's separation from his mother, the genuine menace of the evil queen in Snow White, of Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty, of the witch in Snow White. The Disney tradition had always contained darkness. It had always been at its most emotionally powerful moments, in dialogue with grief and fear and the specific anxieties of childhood, in ways that the studio's self-presentation as the purveyor of bright family entertainment tended to obscure. Burton was not making something foreign to the tradition he had absorbed. He was making something that looked back at the tradition honestly and found there the shadow that the tradition had always cast. The studio saw the shadow and fired him for casting it. What I want to show you now is the part of the Tim Burton story that the triumph narrative, the Disney outcast who became a Hollywood legend, papers over with the momentum of the success. It is the question of what the success cost, of what the mainstream embrace of his vision actually looked like from the inside. Because the industry that eventually embraced him was not Disney, but it was not indifferent to control either. It processed his strangeness differently. It gave him more room, and it also, in specific and documentable ways, extracted things from the work in exchange for the room. What I want to examine is those specific things, the negotiations, the compromises, the moments when the institutional logic pressed against the creative logic and one of them gave way. Because that examination is where the most honest account of this career lives. And it begins with a casting decision for a superhero film that generated tens of thousands of complaint letters and ended up changing the history of Hollywood blockbusters. Stay with me. He left Disney in 1984 and entered a period of genuine professional uncertainty whose specific texture, the state of a young filmmaker with a small body of work that the primary institution in his field had determined was not commercially viable. The biographical accounts tend to pass through quickly in their haste to arrive at the success that followed. The success was not immediately available. He spent time developing projects that did not get made. He worked in the specific liminal space of the Hollywood development system, the space of meetings and pitches and options and almost green lights. That is the standard experience of filmmakers without established commercial credentials. And that is enormously difficult to navigate with both creative integrity and professional momentum intact. Paul Rubens was the connection that changed the trajectory. Rubens had developed the Pee Wee Herman character through live stage performances and television appearances, and the character had built an audience of sufficient scale that Warner Bros. Was willing to invest in a feature film with a budget of $6 million to translate the Pee Wee property to the theatrical format. Someone in the process identified Burton as the director, and Pee Wee's Big Adventure, released in 1985, was his first feature film. The commercial result, it grossed over $23 million on a $6 million budget. A significant return by any accounting, established him as a commercially viable director. What the film also established, for people who watched it with attention, was the specific quality of his visual intelligence and his tonal range. The ability to work within the framework of a commercial comedy built around someone else's character, and to find within that framework space for a visual imagination and a specific relationship to the American landscape that were his own, rather than simply the director's execution of someone else's creative vision. Beetlejuice, released in 1988, was the film in which the space he found was larger. Warner Bros., encouraged by the commercial performance of Pee Wee's Big Adventure, gave him a somewhat more expansive mandate. The result? A film about a recently deceased couple who hire a freelance bioexorcist to remove the living family that has moved into their house after their death. Was the first film he made that critics recognize as a fully Burton-esque work. A film in which the visual design, the tonal register, the specific quality of the humor, and the emotional architecture were all expressions of a unified creative sensibility rather than the application of craft in service of an external brief. The afterlife sequences. Michael Keaton's performance as Beetlejuice. Chaotic, dangerous, profoundly funny, operating entirely outside the social and moral conventions of every world he inhabited. The specific tone of the film, dark and comic and strange and genuinely unsettling in places, and genuinely moving in others, all of those registers held simultaneously without any of them cancelling the others. Beetlejuice grossed over $70 million on a budget of $15 million. Warner Bros. Noted the commercial ratio. They came to him with something larger. Batman in 1989 was the project. Not an original story, not a small-scale personal film, but the adaptation of one of the most commercially valuable intellectual properties in American popular culture. With a production budget of $35 million and the weight of audience expectation that a cultural icon of Batman's history carried into any adaptation, the casting of Michael Keaton as Bruce Wayne and Batman, the decision that generated tens of thousands of complaint letters to the studio before a single frame of the film had been publicly screened, the decision that the comic book press and the fan community treated as evidence that the production was going to fail, was his choice. Made in the face of institutional pressure toward more conventionally heroic casting, the choice was vindicated by the performance and by the commercial result. Batman grossed over $400 million worldwide. It was the highest grossing film of 1989. $400 million changes a filmmaker's relationship with the institutional machinery they work within. The leverage that Pee Wee's Big Adventure had given him was modest. The leverage that Batman generated was enormous. he used it. Batman Returns in 1992 was the film in which the use of the leverage was most visible. The film that was most clearly a Tim Burton film, made in the context of a franchise obligation, rather than a franchise film that happened to have been directed by Tim Burton. The Penguin's origin, reimagined as a baby born, physically wrong, rejected by his parents, raised by penguins in the sewers beneath Gotham City, and returned to the surface as an adult consumed by the grief and rage of abandonment, is not the narrative architecture of a blockbuster franchise film organized around accessibility and broad commercial appeal. It is the narrative architecture of a Tim Burton film about the outsider, the rejected, the creature that the world has decided it cannot accommodate, displaced into the body of a Batman villain. Catwoman's transformation, a meek, overlooked secretary, killed by her employer and resurrected by cats. Who returns as an Avenger whose relationship to heroism and villainy, insanity, and the conventional moral categories of the superhero genre is genuinely uncertain. Is the kind of female character that the superhero film had not produced before and has not consistently produced since. Michelle Pfeiffer's performance in the role is, in the assessment of critics who have engaged seriously with the film, one of the great performances in the superhero genre. A performance of genuine psychological complexity that the film's visual and narrative design fully supports. Batman Returns is a stranger film than Batman, more personal, more invested in the psychological depths of its secondary characters than in the plot mechanics of the genre. It is, in the assessment of critics and film scholars who have examined the Batman film series carefully, the most genuinely Burton-esque of the Batman films. Warner Bros. Was not entirely pleased. The film grossed over $260 million worldwide, which was commercially successful in absolute terms, but below the expectations set by its predecessor. The merchandise licensing revenue was lower than projected. McDonald's, which had entered a promotional partnership with the film, received complaints from parents about the film's content. Warner Bros. Communicated that the third Batman film would need to be more family-friendly, more accessible, more organized around the commercial requirements of a franchise property whose value was determined partly by its capacity to generate toy and merchandise revenue at the scale that children's entertainment generates. He left. He has described the decision in various interviews as a choice rather than a concession. A recognition that making a third Batman film under the constraints being proposed was not something he wanted to do. That the specific version of the Batman film the studio needed him to make was not a version he could make. The distinction matters. He was not fired. He was the director who had made $400 million for the studio and who declined to make more $400 million on terms that would have required compromising the specific quality of creative engagement that made the work worth doing. Batman Forever, directed by Joel Schumacher, was released in 1995. It grossed over $330 million worldwide and has been the subject, in the decade since its release, of a critical consensus that what the franchise lost when Burton left was not commercially quantifiable but was real. I want to pause here and name something directly. The story so far has the shape of the triumph narrative, the misfit who built enough commercial credibility to protect his vision from the institutional pressure that had originally rejected it. And that shape is not wrong. The commercial success was real and it provided real protection. But I want to examine what happened next in the decade after Batman Returns, when the protection was at its maximum, and the specific choices he made with it reveal something more complicated than the triumph narrative contains. Because Ed Wood lost money. Because the late 90s brought a period of creative uncertainty that the biographical accounts treat as a brief intermission before the next chapter, and that looks examined closely more like a reckoning. And because the question of what a genuinely singular creative sensibility does when it has maximum institutional support and minimum external pressure when there is nothing left to push against, is a question that his career answers in ways that are more instructive than the official account has been willing to acknowledge. Ed Wood, released in 1994, was the film he made in the immediate aftermath of leaving the Batman franchise. And it is the film in his career that most directly states what he believes about the act of making things that the world does not want. Edward D. Wood Jr. was a real person, a director who made Plan 9 from Outer Space and Glenn, or Glenda, and a series of other low-budget films in the 1950s that had been classified by the critical culture of the 1970s and 1980s as the worst films ever made. Objects of affectionate ridicule whose badness had achieved a specific cultural value as the most extreme available examples of failed filmmaking. The critical consensus on Ed Wood's films was that they were evidence of incompetence. His response to that consensus was not shared. He saw in Wood a person who made things because he had to make them, who found in the making of things an expression of something genuinely his, and for whom the critical and commercial assessment of the things made was not the measure of whether the making had been worthwhile. He made the film in black and white, deliberately invoking the visual register of the era of Wood's work. He cast Johnny Depp, who had become his most important creative collaborator after Edward Scissorhands, as Wood, in a performance of extraordinary warmth and sincerity that treated the character not as a figure of ridicule, but as a man of genuine feeling who made films about the things that mattered to him and who brought to the making of those films a commitment that the world's assessment of the results did not diminish. He cast Martin Landau as Bela Lugosi, the aging horror icon who had been Wood's collaborator in the final years of his life and who appears in Ed Wood's films as a ruined version of his former self, still committed to the work, still finding in the work something that sustained him against the indifference of an industry that had moved on without him. Landau won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. The performance earned it. Ed Wood grossed approximately $5 million against a production budget of $18 million. It was, by any commercial accounting, a failure. It was received by critics as one of his best films, as a work of genuine affection and genuine depth, and as the most direct statement he had made about his own creative psychology. The commercial failure and the critical success were received differently by the studio than the commercial failures and critical successes of the Disney period. Because he was now a filmmaker whose commercial power was established and whose creative choices could be understood as deliberate rather than as evidence of a sensibility that didn't know what the market required. He had made Ed Wood knowing it would not be Batman. He had made it because it was the film he needed to make. The studio processed the loss. He moved on. The decade between Ed Wood in 1994 and Big Fish in 2003 was the period of the career that the biographical accounts tend to move through with the least sustained attention. Partly because the films of that period, with the exception of Sleepy Hollow in 1999, were not the films that generated the most enthusiastic critical response. And partly because the biographical narrative that the entertainment press had constructed around him, the genius outsider, the dark visionary, the commercial maverick, was most coherently illustrated by the films on either side of the decade rather than by the decade itself. Mars Attacks in 1996 was a deliberately broad comedic pastiche of 1950s science fiction invasion films that had the specific quality of a film made in full awareness of its own genre, references, and that critics found inconsistently successful in the execution. Sleepy Hollow in 1999 was the most visually accomplished film of the period, a genuine gothic horror piece whose production design achieved the specific quality of a landscape that exists to express psychological states. a village perpetually on the edge of autumn, perpetually in the shadow of something coming that his best visual work achieves, and that he has always been more consistent at achieving in production design than at the level of story. Big Fish, released in 2003, was the film that broke the decade-long pattern, and that critics and audiences received as a genuine return, not to the dark aesthetic of the earlier work, but to something that had always been present in the best of his films, and that the darker period had partially obscured: the emotional directness, the genuine sentiment that the Gothic aesthetic had always been in service of rather than in opposition to. The film is about a son trying to understand his dying father by separating the true stories from the tall tales the father has told about his life. It is, in its deepest register, a film about the relationship between the stories we tell and the truth they contain, about whether a life told in myth and exaggeration and the specific kind of fabulation that transforms ordinary experience into something luminous is a lie or a form of truth that ordinary recounting cannot access. It is the most emotionally naked film he made to that point in his career. It performed well commercially. It was, by the assessment of critics who wrote about it at the time and of viewers who have returned to it in the years since, the most fully human of his films. The collaboration with Johnny Depp that had begun with Edward Scissorhands and continued through Edward produced, across the decade and a half following Big Fish, a series of films: Charlie and the Chocolate Factory in 2005, Sweeney Todd in 2007, Dark Shadows in 2012, the animated Frankenweenie remake in 2012, that were received with varying degrees of critical enthusiasm, and that collectively trace the specific arc of a creative partnership whose early work had been defined by the specific alchemy of two sensibilities, finding in each other a quality of mutual understanding that neither could access elsewhere. Depp's later performances in the Burton films were the subject of critical commentary that noted, with increasing frequency, a quality of mannerism that the earlier performances had not exhibited, a reliance on external eccentricities of costume and voice and physical gesture that seemed, in a critical assessment, to be doing the work that genuine character interiority had done in Edward Scissorhands and Ed Wood. Whether this represented a decline in the quality of the collaboration or the natural trajectory of any creative partnership that operates across a long enough period is a question the accounts answer differently. The collaboration with Helena Bonham Carter that began with Planet of the Apes in 2001 and became the defining creative and personal relationship of the middle period of his career is worth examining, not simply as biographical context, but as an illustration of the specific way his most sustained creative partnerships have functioned. Bonham Carter was, when they met, an actress whose career had been built primarily on period roles, the Merchant Ivory productions, the Helena of the 1990s, whose specific quality was a kind of pre-Raphaelite gravity, a presence organized around restraint and precision, rather than the quality of expansive physical performance that his work tended to require. What he found in her, and what the 8 films they made together produced, was an actress who could inhabit the specific register of his visual world, who could be grotesque and sympathetic simultaneously, who could play the damaged and the strange and the deliberately wrong-shaped without the register of self-consciousness that those performances tend to produce in performers who are not fully committed to the specific logic of the world the film has constructed. Corpse Bride in 2005, which she voiced, was the clearest expression of what the creative partnership generated. At its most focused, an animated film in which the visual world was the fullest realization of the stop-motion aesthetic that had begun with Vincent, in which the world of the dead was more vibrant and more alive than the world of the living, in exactly the way that his sensibility had always suggested it should be, and in which the specific emotional territory, the creature who loves and is not wanted, the boy who is wanted by the wrong creature, the specific grief of the thing that was made for belonging and finds itself displaced from every context in which belonging should be available, was the territory that his work had been exploring since the drawings in the Burbank bedroom. Sweeney Todd, in 2007, adapted from Stephen Sondheim's stage musical and requiring both Depp and Bonham Carter to carry the singing that the musical form demanded, was received as one of his most technically accomplished films and one of his most emotionally cold. A film of extraordinary visual and formal achievement whose relationship to the characters it was depicting was more surgical than empathetic. The critical assessment was fair. The achievement was real. The specific quality that makes his best work feel necessary rather than accomplished. The quality of genuine emotional investment in the strangeness rather than elegant management of it was not consistently present. The decade between Big Fish and the arrival of what most critics would identify as his last fully realized major work produced a career trajectory that was commercially successful and creatively uneven in ways that the biographical accounts have tended to attribute to the specific circumstances of individual productions rather than to any structural feature of his relationship with the industrial system he was working within. Dark Shadows in 2012 was received as a misfired comedy whose tone could not decide between affectionate parody and genuine horror, and that consequently achieved neither. Alice in Wonderland in 2010 grossed over $1 billion worldwide, making it by far the most commercially successful film of his career, and received critical assessments ranging from mild appreciation to genuine hostility, with the consensus settling somewhere in the territory of a technically impressive spectacle that had not found a way to make the emotional content of the material as vivid as the visual content. Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children in 2016 was received as a competent execution of adapted source material that demonstrated his continued visual intelligence and limited the specific quality, personal investment that his most distinctive work had always carried. The Nightmare Before Christmas, released in 1993 and produced by Disney's subsidiary Touchstone Pictures, was the formal beginning of his return to a working relationship with the studio that had fired him 9 years earlier. The film was based on a poem and a set of characters that he had developed during his time at Disney in the early 1980s. Concepts created as an employee whose rights therefore belonged to the studio. Disney had owned the Nightmare Before Christmas concept for 9 years and had not developed it. When the commercial landscape had shifted sufficiently, when the commercial success of his post-Disney work had demonstrated that the dark and strange aesthetic he had always been trying to make was in fact commercially viable, the studio agreed to produce it. Through Touchstone, rather than through the Disney label proper, a distinction whose significance was not lost on observers who noted that the studio was willing to associate its commercial apparatus with the project while maintaining the brand distance that the main label's family entertainment identity required. He did not direct The Nightmare Before Christmas. He produced it. Henry Selick directed it. The specific circumstances, his commitment to Batman Returns, prevented him from taking the director's chair. Produced the specific attribution dispute that has followed the film across its 30 years of cultural life, the degree to which it is a Tim Burton film, as the marketing has always presented it, versus a Henry Selick film, as Selick and the advocates for directorial primacy and film attribution have argued. The honest answer is that it is both. In the specific way that the most significant collaborative creative works are both things simultaneously, Selick's directorial intelligence and craft are present throughout, and Burton's conceptual vision and aesthetic sensibility are the foundation that Selick's craft is building on. The marketing chose Burton's name because Burton's name was commercially larger. That fact is itself a precise illustration of how institutional power distributes credit. The Nightmare Before Christmas grossed approximately $50 million in its initial theatrical release and has since generated many multiples of that in merchandise theme park applications. And the specific ongoing cultural currency of a film that has maintained a continuous presence in popular culture across 3 decades, it has become, in the years since its release, one of the most commercially valuable properties in Disney's catalog, a property whose value was not visible to the institution when the concept was developed inside it in the early 1980s, and that became visible only after the creator who developed it had been fired, had spent a decade making work outside the institution, had achieved commercial credibility through that outside work, and had returned to the institution on terms the institution found acceptable. The calculation of what Disney lost by not developing the concept in 1982, by not understanding what they had in the animator who was making Vincent on their premises, is a calculation that the studio has never made publicly. It would not be a comfortable calculation. Dumbo, in 2019, the live-action remake commissioned by Disney, was the formal completion of the circuit and the most precise available illustration of the specific dynamic this documentary has been examining. The director, whose early work had been rejected by the studio, whose creative identity had been formed by the rejection and by the decades of work that followed it, was invited back by the studio to remake one of its classic properties in the context of the studio's systematic strategy of converting its animated library into live-action films. He made it. It received mixed reviews and modest commercial performance. The critical conversation about it centered on a question that the film's specific character made unavoidable. What happens when a filmmaker whose creative identity was formed by the rejection of institutional frameworks is asked to work at the absolute center of one of those frameworks, in the service of a commercial strategy whose purpose is the extraction of existing intellectual property value rather than the creation of new work? The answer the film provided was not a simple answer. There is genuine visual invention in Dumbo. There are sequences that reflect the specific quality of his best work, the quality of a visual imagination that constructs images from the logic of emotional experience rather than the logic of spatial reality. The flying sequences, the circus environment, the specific atmosphere of a world that is simultaneously spectacular and melancholy. And there are also sequences in which the institutional weight of the production, the requirement to honor the original, to serve the franchise strategy, to produce a film that the Disney machine can market to its global audience, presses against the creative logic and wins. The film is a Tim Burton film. It is also a Disney live-action remake. The two things were not fully compatible, and the specific character of the film, the places where it achieved what his best work achieved, and the places where it settled for less, is the product of that specific incompatibility. 6 minutes of Vincent, made in a Disney studio in 1982 by a 23-year-old animator who had not yet made anything that the world had seen, contains more of the essential Tim Burton than the 112 minutes of Dumbo, made in 2019 by one of the most commercially powerful filmmakers of his generation with the full resources of the most powerful entertainment company on earth. Both are Tim Burton. The distance between them, in budget, in scale, in institutional support, in the weight of commercial obligation, is enormous. The distance in the specific quality that makes his work, the quality of genuine creative necessity, of a sensibility making something it had to make, rather than something the institution needed it to make, runs in the opposite direction. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It is what the work shows. Timothy Walter Burton, born August 25th, 1958, in Burbank, California, in the specific American suburb that his films have been examining and subverting for his entire career. The boy who drew monsters in his bedroom and found in German expressionist cinema a visual vocabulary for the interior landscape that the exterior world did not provide. The animator hired by Disney in 1979, who made a 6-minute black and white masterpiece and had it shelved, the filmmaker who turned Beetlejuice into a studio success and Batman into a cultural event, and then walked away from the franchise rather than make it something it wasn't. The man who made Ed Wood, which lost money and stated, with as much directness as his work has ever achieved, what he believed the act of making things was actually for. The director who returned to Disney on Disney's terms and made a film that is less than what he can do and more than the institutional framework could fully contain. Disney's rejection of Tim Burton in 1984 was not the end of the story. It was the condition of the story. The rejection sent a specific creative sensibility out of the institution that had formed it and into the conditions. The collaborations, the specific combination of commercial success and creative latitude that his subsequent career navigated, in which that sensibility could do what it was capable of doing. Vincent Price was right. Vincent was a masterpiece. Disney was wrong. It was not the kind of thing Disney made. The gap between those two true statements is the gap that Tim Burton built his career in. And the career built in that gap is one of the most instructive documents available about the specific relationship between genuine creative vision and the institutional power that surrounds it. About what the power takes, and about what, despite everything the power takes, it cannot touch. The boy in the Burbank bedroom who watched horror films on late night television and drew monsters in his sketchbooks and felt the specific wrongness of the suburb that was supposed to be his home. That boy made Vincent in 1982, and it was shelved, and he was fired, and he made Batman, and it was a cultural event, and he made Ed Wood, and it lost money. And he made Corpse Bride and Sweeney Todd and Big Fish, and Alice in Wonderland grossed $1 billion, and Disney hired him back and gave him Dumbo. And through all of it, through the success and the failure and the compromise and the creative latitude and the institutional constraint, the boy in the bedroom was still there, in the margins, in the cracks. In the 6 minutes of black and white stop motion that Disney shelved, and that is still, 40 years later, the most precise available map of who he is and what he is for, that is what the rejection produced. Not the career. The career was what the rejection protected. What the rejection produced was the knowledge, the specific, hard-won, irreversible knowledge that the work was his, regardless of what any institution decided to do with it. This is the celebrity code, and the code, once you see it, cannot be unseen.